Um, our next speaker will be Jared Goplen. He's an extension educator from the University of Minnesota Extension Service. He'll give a talk for approximately 25 minutes, then try to leave about 5 minutes for questions at the end. You can submit questions either through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or the chat. And all of these sessions will be available to be played back as a recording by the end of the week on the minnesotawheat.org website. Okay, go ahead, Jared Goplen.
All right, thanks, Gary. And just to double check, you can see my slide in full screen, correct?
Yes.
Great, sounds good. Well, hello everybody, good morning. It's good to be with you guys here today. Certainly is a little bit weird seeing only my own talking head on the screen, even though there's a couple hundred of you in attendance, I think. Thankfully, I did get in on a stale donut and some coffee this morning, as if we were in person. So at least I have that going for me as we would be in person. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about really making small grains work in the crop rotation. So like Gary said, Jared Goplen, I'm normally based out of the Morris Regional Office in Western Minnesota. Currently sitting in my house basically between Dawson and Canby, so in southwestern Minnesota. And kind of taking a shift in gears today from the talks this morning and really focusing a little more on some of the agronomic topics. You know, obviously a lot of discussion on shifting crop rotations, you know, with changing markets and those types of things. I'm going to address some of those things, and I'm going to give some food for thought when you're making some of these decisions. I'll talk about some of the kind of repercussions, the things to keep in mind with soybean cyst nematode, weeds, and those types of things if we do change the rotation. All right, some of you are going to have to bear with me a little. I know we've got attendees all the way from darn near the Canadian border, all the way down into southern Minnesota. So obviously a huge difference in crop rotations and those types of things. But regardless, I think there's something for everybody here, some topics at least to take home and give you something to think about. So obviously there's a lot of considerations, when you're growing small grains. Some of you, maybe it's one of the primary crops. Others, maybe it's something you've been thinking. You've primarily grown corn and soybeans, thinking about adding a third or fourth crop to that rotation. Regardless of the situation, there's a lot of considerations on which fields, whether it's soybean cyst nematode, which is a topic I'll talk about here in just a minute. Really some of these rotation effects. Weeds have become a bigger problem, especially in soybeans and sugar beet production. If you guys grow soybeans or sugar beets, certain crops are just better suited for some areas. Maybe you have some lighter soils, sandier soils that, there's just not enough water holding capacity there to grow corn without irrigation. Maybe some of you guys want to put in some tile drainage. You got livestock, you need somewhere to put manure. There's a lot of different reasons people grow small grains. There's also some risk management reasons. Some years we have really good corn weather. Other years we have really good small grain weather. And a lot of times they don't necessarily overlap that well. So it does kind of help to hedge some of that risk in terms of weather. Obviously spreads out workload, crop prices. A lot of these things you guys already know. I'm going to talk about a few different things today, though. I'm going to focus a little bit on yield and how crop rotations can affect rotational crop yield. So if we have a small grain in the rotation, how does that affect your corn yield versus just a corn soybean rotation? We'll talk a little on weeds, soybean cyst nematodes, and some other things we can do with a small grain, especially if we talk about cover crops and the whole soil health thing. That's certainly got a lot of press and attention lately. It's a little bit easier to do when we have a shorter season crop like a small grain. Not going to spend a lot of time on the impacts of crop rotation on disease and insects. There's a lot of positive benefits there. In general, diseases, any of the diseases that survive on crop residue, the longer that window is that we can stay away from that crop, the more time or the more residue is going to be degraded, the less likely you're going to have disease issues. That's kind of the same concept with any of these diseases that need crop residue to survive. So corn, there's a list of a few, things like Goss's wilt, leaf blight, great leaf spot, and a number of other ones that aren't even listed necessarily here. Soybean, things like brown stem rot, sudden death, Cercospora. There's, again, additional diseases there as well. Anything that might overwinter or survive on crop residue, you're going to have some effect. Certainly not going to be a cure-all, but it will have some level of effect. In terms of the insect pressure, probably the one that's gotten the most attention lately is corn rootworm. Certainly was a pretty big issue in some areas in southern Maine. A lot of people had, at least in the past, been thinking about planting or have been planting non-traded corn, non-BT corn. Obviously, if you have a wider crop rotation, that's a lot easier, a lot less risk with planting some of these varieties. So you might be able to save some money on seed for your corn, but really that's cost savings is because you had that additional crop in that rotation. The one I'm going to share a couple more slides on, though, is soybean cyst nematode. That's one that's gotten, probably hasn't gotten the press it deserves lately. We've seen soybean cyst nematode become much more problematic. Some of the resistances are falling apart and causing some pretty significant yield reductions, even though we might not see those yield reductions or realize it. So here's a slide from Greg Tilka down in Iowa. He's been doing a ton of soybean cyst nematode work over the last several decades. Similar trends, I guess, have been seen in southern Minnesota and even into central Minnesota as well. And really what you need to know here is there's a couple of different commonly available forms of resistance to SCN, soybean cyst nematode. The big one, the most widely available, is this plant introduction 88788 form of resistance. That's where most all of the varieties that you see, looking through that seed catalog, if it says yes, it has resistance, chances are it has that form of resistance. Now this is an on-farm trial, so a farmer in Iowa planted the normal variety, always would, actually 2 varieties on this field that had this 88788 form of resistance. And Greg Tilka also had a trial in that same field. And the Peking resistant varieties, this different form of resistance that so far has held up a little bit better, yielded about 72 bushels an acre, whereas that 88788 only yielded 50. So in this field, if that farmer had known that his soybean cyst nematode resistant variety wasn't really holding up, wasn't really doing what it was supposed to be doing, it ended up leaving about 22 bushels an acre on the table. Obviously, that's a heck of a lot of money, and if this resistance creeps in and we don't realize it, certainly can take its toll. So here's what that field or that trial actually looked like. So this graph kind of looks like it's got a lot going on, but really what you need to know is each bar is its own variety. The green bars are Peking resistance. The gray ones are the 88788, and then the sort of mustard are susceptible. They don't have any form of SCN resistance. The vertical axis then is yield, and basically from 0 all the way to 80 bushels per acre. The green bars with the Peking, they had basically 72 to 74 bushels an acre, both of those. The gray bars with that 88788, anywhere from about 58 bushels an acre all the way down to about 40. And then the susceptible, anywhere from about 32 to about 55 bushels an acre. So even though, this farmer thought he was planting resistant variety of an 88788, really wasn't doing its job. And I'm not going to share that slide, but if we showed you the reproduction, how many eggs ended up being sampled in each of these plots at the end of the growing season, many of the 88788 varieties had just as much reproduction as the susceptible soybean, or that Peking still had relatively low levels of reproduction. Really just saying that Peking so far in this case is holding up, the 88788 isn't. So here's a map, I guess, just showing, since we do have such a wide range of geography. This was a project that we had done with Angie Peltier a couple of years ago now with Minnesota soybean funding, and basically just a sample for SCN, especially focused on the northwestern Minnesota counties where a lot of you guys are sitting. And really the main thing here is, well, we've known we've had SCN in southern Minnesota for a long time. A lot of people aren't even necessarily sampling, or they've kind of forgotten about it in recent years. They just expect it to be there. But really what we're seeing is SCN is really creeping up into the Northwest, especially as soybeans have become much more widely planted in the last decade or two. And certainly finding some populations that are pretty alarming and probably causing some yield reductions, really in that similar range of what that Iowa farmer found, maybe up to 22 bushels an acre difference. So it is everywhere, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. If you are sitting in the Northwest and thinking, well, shoot, I haven't sampled for SCN in a long time, or never have, I don't know if I even have it. Certainly it's a cheap thing to do, get those samples taken. But really there's a few things, and I'm going to get into this in a bit, that you can, I guess, it'll give you a little bit of comfort. If you have more than just a corn soybean rotation or planting soybeans every other year, the likelihood of these populations building is certainly reduced with crop rotation. So that's definitely one of the big benefits of having 3-4 crops in the rotation. Just staying away from that soybean for a couple of years will make a huge impact on reducing those numbers. And if you guys have questions throughout the talk, feel free to enter them into the chat. As we go, if you're like me, you'll forget the question by the end. So if you want to, feel free to type it in there so it's there for when we get to the end. By all means, go for it. So that's all I'll say for SCN for now. There's a lot of benefits there in terms of rotation. Another topic I'll just talk about briefly is herbicide resistance. So and weed management, I guess. So Minnesota, North Dakota, we've got 16 weed species that we know that have resistance. Some of the big ones, especially in the northern part of the state, is common ragweed. Any of the populations of common ragweed probably have resistance to Roundup, as well as the ALS inhibitors like Pursuit, Raptor, those types of products. Giant ragweed's the same story. We think we probably have some resistance to the PPO inhibitors in the ragweeds as well, probably some HPPDs like the Callisto, Lotus, those types of products as well. Kochia, some of you guys up in that northern part might be battling with Kochia, certainly another problematic weed when it comes to herbicide resistance. Water hemp is probably the one that gets the most attention. Certainly throughout southern Min, water hemp is everything. That's what almost all weed management programs are designed around. And we have pretty widespread resistance to Roundup and the PPOs like Flexstar, Cobra. A couple of things that concern me with water hemp. Number one, some of our friends further south like Missouri and Illinois have resistance to over 6 modes of action now. So basically pick 6 different modes of action like Roundup, Pursuit, Callisto, Flexstar, and a number of other, pick 2 additional ones. You can spray all of those products at the same time on these populations and they're still not going to die. So certainly causing a lot of concern there. So far, we don't have these in Minnesota, but it's probably only a matter of time. Another thing that's really concerning is this resistance to group 15 herbicides. So any of you who use Dual, Warrant, Zidua, Outlook, Harness, any of those group 15 herbicides, there's a few populations in Illinois and elsewhere that now have resistance to these residual herbicides. So, typically we haven't been too concerned about those, but in the last few years, those residual products have not been working. And that's a huge concern, especially if we think about a sugar beet producer, who relies a lot on Dual to control water hemp and some of the other pigweeds. So resistance isn't going away. So really what we have to do is think about other strategies to manage resistance. And one of the things I like to bring up is the weed seed bank. So really thinking about battling these weeds, we need to think about kind of the weak point and where we can sort of attack some of these weeds. Herbicides aren't certainly going to be the only answer. We've already got resistance to dicamba and 2,4-D, even though these traits are becoming more widely available and certainly helpful in managing these populations. But that weed seed bank is really what I want you to think about. This table here shows a few different weed species on the left side, and on the right side, it shows you the half-life. So basically the number of years it takes to deplete 50% of those weed seeds. So lance quarters, if you had a lance quarters plant out there that produced seed, those seeds went down into the soil, come back 2 years later, about half of those weed seeds are gone, the other half are still there. Come back another 2 years later, you got about 25% of the total weed seeds that are still there after 4 years. A couple of the big weeds, like common ragweed, thankfully we only have about 3/4 of a year for a half-life. Giant ragweed, 96% of those weed seeds are gone in just 2 years. Water hemp, if we can prevent seed production for 4 years, over 99% of those weed seeds are gone. So of course that's the $1 million question is how do you prevent weed seed production, right? Well, crop rotation is certainly a part of that. If you think about anyone with alfalfa or some of these perennial crops, it's pretty easy to prevent seed production of water hemp in an alfalfa field. So more crop rotation certainly can help us battle this weed seed bank, deplete those numbers, at least to manageable levels. So our herbicide programs, tillages are going to take care of some of those populations. The other thing I want you to think about is where your weeds come from. So if you're a sugar beet guy, this is something you probably think about a little more often than others, is just because we tend to struggle a lot more in sugar beets to control weeds, similar to soybeans. So if we think about, say, that ragweed population that's out in your sugar beets or soybean field, where did those weed seeds come from? Where did those plants actually come from? Well, we know that the ragweeds and water hemp don't stick around that long. So chances are that those seeds were produced in the last 2 years. At least a good majority of those were in the last couple of years. So let's think about that crop rotation system and how we can maybe make some changes to that system to prevent seed production. One of those things is going to be, targeting when those weeds are actually flowering and producing viable seeds. So certainly nothing complicated here, but let's think about harvest timing with a small grain versus really corn and soybeans compared to our commonly weeds throughout the state. So here, basically, to orient you to the graph, we've got the calendar on the bottom. We've got kochia, ragweed, lamb's quarters, and pigweed and water hemp. And really, these red bars are showing the sort of predicted rough estimate of when those weeds are flowering. When they're done flowering, so about the end of that bar is when they produce viable seeds. So if we think about small grains in a rotation or alfalfa, like on the top, fork cutting system, chances are there's not going to be much seed production of these annual weeds. Small grain, even if we do, let's say we do have a car crash, we have a bunch of common ragweed that comes through our wheat field. On a good year, if we can get that small grain harvested and by mid-August, that ragweed really hasn't produced viable seeds yet. So even if it looks ugly, there's a lot of ragweed out there, going through with that combine, you're clipping those plants off. Even if you run those plants through the combine, there's no viable seeds yet. So you're really eliminating seed production, at least for 1 year. Now you're probably gonna have to come back after harvest and do a burn down or some tillage to actually take out those weeds. But in general, there's a lot more opportunity to prevent seed production with small grains compared to corn or soybean, which obviously aren't harvested until later in the season. Most of those weeds have produced viable seed by that time. Seed goes through the combine, gets spread throughout the field, adds back to that weed seed bank and causes issues. So when those weed seeds actually shatter is another important characteristic. So with corn and soybean, there's been a lot of attention, and even wheat for that matter, small grains. You've probably seen in some of the farm journals and other news media on some of the seed destructors, the Harrington weed seed destructor, the seed destructor that are basically hammer mills that attach to the back of a combine. Basically put all the chaff through this hammer mill, chops up those weed seeds, basically hammers that weed seed enough time so that it's not going to be viable, and then spreads them back out on the field. Well, any of these technologies, in order for them to work, those weed seeds have to actually make it into the combine. So, first off, corn probably isn't going to be a great candidate for these systems to work just because there's going to be a lot of weed seeds shattering off the corn head. Soybeans, the weeds, as long as they maintain their seed by the time we harvest, it'll probably work all right. Most of the time, these weed seeds start to drop sort of in that mid-September range and continue through October, the end of October. So all this sounds great, right? Having more diverse rotations, 3 or 4 crops with a small grain, maybe some forage, maybe some sugar beets. It all sounds good. There's some weed control benefits there. There's some SCN benefits. What about the economics? Obviously, that's the primary driver in this world. Just because it sounds good doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make you money. So what does that look like? I'm not going to go into really much detail on some of these crop rotations and long-term yields, but they're out there. I'll summarize a couple of key points. Number one, corn only needs a 1-year break to maximize yield. It doesn't really care if it's in a 6-way rotation. As long as you give it 1-year break, after soybeans, it's happy. Soybeans really do benefit from more than a 1-year break. So if you can have a 3rd crop in the rotation, your soybean yields will probably be greater. Typically, a lot of these long-term trials have found really 5 to 8% greater soybean yields with a 3-year rotation versus just corn-soybean rotation. So having that and maintaining that rotation, we are going to see some slight increases, at least in yield. This graph here basically just shows you some of the summaries of that. So the left-hand vertical axis is basically grain yield from 0 to about 250 bushels an acre. The first 4 bars show corn yields, in a corn-soybean rotation, corn-soybean wheat, corn, wheat, soybeans, and corn on corn. You can see corn, when grown following wheat, it's about 213 bushels an acre versus corn-soybean at at about 200. So about 11% greater yields on corn in that three-way rotation compared to just a corn-soybean rotation. Soybeans, a similar story. You know, that three-way rotation, that second bar, 64 bushels an acre versus a corn-soybean rotation of about 60. Obviously continuous soybeans in this trial, 50 is probably a pretty generous estimate. Some areas with cyst, nematode, and other disease issues, that yield's probably going to be quite a bit lower. Of course, then we get into the wheat yields on the far right in the green bars. Corn, soybean, wheat really is the sweet spot, putting that wheat after soybeans, about 70 bushels an acre. You know, if we flip-flop that kind of in the non-recommended fashion, so wheat's following corn, about a 10 bushel yield hit, just based on some disease management and those types of things. So really that three-year rotation does have higher yields. I think I'm probably getting a little close on time. I think I'll be all right. But so if we plug these yields into some of the crop budgets that are out there, these basically are put together by the U of M Extension Ag Business folks. This was from Nathan Holinsky for Northwest Minnesota. And I actually went in and I made a few tweaks. So I went in and basically pulled some new crop cash prices from, I think, about 5 or 6 elevators in the Northwest yesterday afternoon. Here's what those new crop prices are in terms of new crop bids were yesterday afternoon. Some predicted yields. And here's what the gross returns, expenses, and projected returns basically are projected by this really the FinBin data set where a lot of these expenses come from. Corn and soybeans, as of yesterday afternoon, were about the same. They're about $88 an acre. I do have a few issues with some of the expenses. I don't think they're perfect estimation, so certainly would encourage everybody to plug their own numbers in, but this is what they had put together. Wheat, about 30 bucks an acre, so not quite as good yet. The problem with any of these really budgets that you see, though, is they really don't take any consideration for crop rotational yield. So I just talked to you about that Wisconsin data set that said, well, three-year rotations yield better. You know, the corn yields better, the soybeans yield better in that rotation. So what happens if we actually take this budget and plug it in to those yield differences? So basically here we have the same rotations: continuous corn, continuous soybeans, corn, soybean, continuous wheat, certainly not a moneymaker, corn, soybeans, wheat, and then corn, wheat, soybeans. And what we see then on the vertical axis is using these same prices from yesterday afternoon, current straw prices of $84 a ton in Sauk Center. This is kind of the way it ends up looking in terms of crop rotation yield or net return in dollars per acre per year. So corn, soybeans, wheat does end up coming up on top, about $103 per acre per year, compared to the corn, soybean rotation, I guess in this case. Now that the previous graph are now the blue bars on this slide. I also added in straw yield. So say we did take straw, this accounts for baling expenses, fertility expenses, some hauling expenses, and basically attributes that to the yellow bars. So, you know, if we do grow wheat in that rotation, corn, soybeans, wheat, do harvest the straw, you know, we can make a little bit extra money. So that's kind of another added benefit, I guess, of having a small grain. There is a few ways to make this system work, depending on what your specific operation is like, whether or not straw harvest is going to be you know, consideration for you. Certainly there is some potential there, though. There are some other benefits to the rotation. You know, obviously those of you who have livestock, especially cattle, you know, having wheat in the rotation certainly is helpful in terms of having a place to spread manure in the summertime after you might harvest some of that small grain. It also opens up a window to plant a cover crop that you might be able to graze in the fall. There's a lot more flexibility with planting cover crops if you're planning to graze them after a small grain, just because of the herbicides we use. You know, 2,4-D, bromoxynil, some of those are a lot more forgiving with cover crops compared to any of the corn and soybean herbicides that are out there. There we go. So just a quick example here. This was basically, you know, so me sitting in southern Minnesota, certainly not prime small grain territory. We like to grow a little bit because we have some beef cattle that we like to get a little bit extra forage from. This year I went out, basically took samples, this cover crop was planted after we harvested wheat in late July, planted the cover crop, ended up with about 2 tons of dry matter per acre. You can see the picture on the right-hand side here. It was just a 16-acre field that ended up producing about 31 tons of dry matter. Basically gave us a month of grazing value. It was dry here most of the summer, and most of that pasture, permanent pasture, was dried up. So having something for them to graze when we would otherwise be feeding hay is certainly a big benefit there. Basically seeding expenses, some fertility, about $40 an acre. I figure we saved probably about $3,000 in feeding hay this summer just by having that small grain in the rotation and planting a cover crop. Now that certainly is not going to be a good fit for everyone. You kind of have to have livestock. Certainly there is some opportunity to mechanically harvest it. You could bale some stuff up. Here's another example, another field that I'd done the same thing, ended up wrapping it as baleage. In terms of a forage value, I figure about $140 an acre in cost savings on a livestock operation. So if you're sitting in the heart of the valley, no livestock within 50 miles of you, probably not going to be a good fit. This is also going to vary a ton based on the year. Some years, like this year, we were able to get the wheat harvested early, in July. If we didn't get it harvested till late August, it's certainly not going to be a money-making endeavor in that situation. But I'll just kind of wrap it up because I think I'm starting to get down there on time here. This graph basically just shows in the green bars some added value of a cover crop if you have some grazing value or forage value. This whole setup, these graphs that I've been showing you, is all on my computer as a spreadsheet. We're working on kind of revamping that and getting it available to everyone. In the meantime, if you want a copy of the spreadsheet to plug in your own numbers, different prices, input costs, I'm more than happy to share it with you. If you want to shoot me an email or something along those lines, feel free to do that. But really just kind of an idea to give you some ideas on how to make the system work. As crop prices get better, you're probably going to be able to make money without, getting fancy or really changing the system. But think about your profitability by the acre or cost of production per bushel. If there's some areas where this makes sense, if you have a field next to a guy that's got cows, see if he wants to give you a little money to plant a cover crop and graze his cows. There certainly is opportunities out there. If you have some fields that have bad weed problems, it's a place to add a third or fourth crop to the rotation. Certainly isn't necessarily going to be a fix-all for your entire operation. It's really all going to be acre specific. So here's my last slide, a couple overview points. SCN is something to pay attention to. Crop rotation can help. Same with weed management. There's some opportunities with straw or forage value when you grow a small grain. That'll make more sense for some of you than others. If you do grow alfalfa, it's another kind of added value point that I've done a number of times, planted alfalfa following small grain harvest, as long as you can get it planted by early August. It's a good way to get full season yields the next year, a way to kind of prevent having to suffer through that seedling year. Make it fit into your system. I realize everybody's system, every acre is going to be different. There's a lot of different ideas here. Hopefully you had something to take home and consider as you go forward thinking about your crop rotations for this next year. So contact info's there if you want to get a hold of me or want a copy of that spreadsheet. Please don't hesitate to reach out.